You don't notice it when it starts, because nothing feels wrong. You press the pedal, the car moves. You brake, it stops. Everything feels normal. But what if I told you that what you're calling your control is already being filtered before it reaches the engine? Modern cars don't just respond anymore. They interpret. They evaluate. They decide. And in some moments, they quietly override you. Not with a warning, not with a notification. Just silence. So the real question is simple. How much of what you're doing inside your car is actually under your control? Because modern cars don't just respond to you instantly, they process you. And most drivers never feel that shift. At first, everything feels familiar, predictable, smooth, almost effortless. But underneath that comfort is something most people never question. Your car is no longer purely mechanical. It is a system built on software, rules, and restrictions already in place before you ever turned the key, which means what you call driving is already operating inside limits you never agreed to directly. Your input doesn't go straight to the machine anymore. It gets filtered first, checked, interpreted, adjusted, and only then does it become motion. So what feels like instant response is actually a controlled translation of your intent, not removal of control, but reshaping of it. And the system doesn't call this control. It calls it safety, stability, protection. But every layer added for protection also quietly defines what the car is not allowed to do. And that's where the real shift begins. Because every improvement comes with a condition attached. More safety, more limits, more intelligence, more rules, more automation, less direct authority. At some point it stops being obvious. Because nothing feels broken. Acceleration still works. Braking still works. Steering still works. But not always the same way. Not always the way you expect. And most people assume that means something is wrong with the car. But often, nothing is wrong at all. The car is simply following instructions you cannot see. This is where driving starts to change quietly. A small delay in response. A slightly different braking feel. A steering correction that feels subtle but unfamiliar. Individually, they mean nothing. Together, they create a pattern. The car is not always matching your intent perfectly anymore. And the strange part is this. It still feels like control. Just not absolute control. Because now every action passes through a second layer. A system evaluating safety, stability, and compliance in real time. And that system can adjust your input before it becomes action. Without warning, without explanation. That means you are no longer the only decision maker inside the vehicle. You are part of a shared system. But only one side of that system is visible to you. The other side stays hidden. And that invisibility is what makes it effective. Because when intervention happens, nothing announces it. No signal, no indicator, no interruption. Just a final result that still feels natural enough not to question. But when you start comparing moments, patterns begin to appear. The same input does not always create the same response. The same car does not always behave the same way. And those differences are not random. They are structured. Control is no longer located in one place. It is distributed between driver input, software logic, and external regulations that define what is allowed in real time. And that distribution slowly changes the relationship between human instinct and machine response. You are still driving, but you are no longer fully defining the outcome alone. The system is interpreting your actions before they become motion, and that interpretation layer is what changes everything. Because now, behavior becomes conditional. Some conditions allow full response, others reduce it, others modify it entirely. And most of the time, you never know which state you are in. Which leads to something most drivers slowly begin to feel, but can't explain clearly. A gap between expectation and outcome. Not large, Not dramatic, but consistent enough to notice over time. And that gap changes perception, because driving used to be simple, now it is, and that middle layer is invisible. This is where ownership starts to lose its old meaning, because ownership used to guarantee consistency. If you control something, it behaves the same way under your input. But now behavior depends on internal rules that can change without you seeing them. And those rules are not fixed. They depend on region, regulation, software versions, and updates that can quietly modify how the vehicle behaves after purchase. So even after you buy the car, it doesn't stay identical. It evolves. Without physical change, without visible warning, just subtle shifts in how it responds. Which means you are no longer interacting with a static machine. You are interacting with a system that can be reconfigured over time. And that reconfiguration does not require your approval in a visible way. At that point, ownership stops being simple possession. It becomes access. Access that can be shaped, adjusted, or limited by systems outside your control. And this is where the deeper question begins to form. If the car can change how it behaves after you buy it, if features can be adjusted remotely, if performance depends on unseen rules, then what exactly are you owning? Because what looks like a machine is now a managed system. A system where behavior is not fully fixed, where control is not fully centralized, and where your input is only one part of the final outcome. You are still driving. But not in the way you think, because every action now passes through a structure that decides how much of it is allowed to become real, and most of that structure is invisible. Which is why nothing feels wrong in the moment. The car still works, still responds, still drives, but the feeling of direct control slowly stops being complete. And once you notice that gap, even slightly, the entire experience of driving changes. Because now every response carries a hidden question. Was that fully me? Or was that adjusted? And that is where the realization lands. You didn't lose control in one moment. You never noticed it shifting. Because it didn't disappear. It was filtered. So the real question is no longer whether you can drive your car. It's how much of that driving is still fully yours at any given moment.